Good evening. I would like to call to order the Kaiser City Council in a work session. It is Monday, October 14th, 2024, and ask our city recorder to please call roll.
Councilor Reed?
Here.
Councilor Quiller?
Here.
Mayor Clark?
Here.
Council President Starr? Here. Councilor Duran?
Here.
Councilor Cross?
And Councilor Cross, I understand, is excused. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. This has been a topic that we have discussed for a long time. We've done many, many studies, and there's been a lot of changes in state regulation over the last couple of years and some in this recent legislative session, and there's a lot of talk about changes for 2025. So this felt like a really good opportunity to at least get everybody understanding kind of where we're at in terms of urban growth boundary, what the regulations are currently, and hear from our staff to bring us up to speed on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Brown.
Okay, thank you, Madam Mayor and Council. We're going to kind of tag team this tonight between Shane and I, Mr. Witham, the Planning Director. And so I would also invite you to ask questions all along the way as they come up. And so without further ado, let's go over just the agenda for it. We'll talk about requirements for UGB amendments, the impact of population estimates, relationship of studies that we have to do in Oregon planning, the alternative to separate or stay together with Salem as a combined UGB, the cost of growth, the governor's one-time allowance, and then kind of end with what do we want to accomplish and consider some public engagement efforts. So what I strive for tonight is for this to be informational, factual, unbiased, and understandable. So in a consumable format that I hope will be very educational for anybody that wants to watch this or look at the material afterwards. So starting off with the requirements for UGB amendments, we often, I'm sure you get asked why can't Kaiser just expand however they want to? And the answer to that, of course, is right now our fates are tied together with Salem, and the state rules govern how and where we can expand as a city, our boundaries. This is just a snapshot of our combined UGB. Up in this corner, or on the top is, oh, it's not showing mine. Let me see if I can. So up on the top of the slide is Kaiser, and what the arrows on the bottom point to are the unannexed land that's in the UGB but connected to the Salem city boundaries. And of course, we don't have any unannexed land in the Kaiser, connecting to the Kaiser current city boundaries. So,
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So the two unincorporated areas, Four Corners and around the Hayesville area, those also are inside UGB, not part of City of Salem.
Mm-hmm.
So that's land that could be if annexed into Salem if they so chose, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep. And it looks like there's a few other little parcels there on the south side also, but. So, according to our documents, Kaiser's comprehensive land use plan supports a shared urban growth boundary, as does Salem, Marion, and Polk counties, coordinated in a regional effort. So, as long as we are tied to Salem, the SCAPAC, the Salem Kaiser Area Planning Advisory Committee, must resolve decisions that result in a change in the regional urban growth boundary. So we have our challenge is that Salem still has a surplus of land type capacity within their urban growth boundary connected to their city. And this is a statement from our cost of growth study in 2018. The entire UGB must be found lacking in capacity prior to adding land. And so these terms get used a lot. And I can tell you that I get confused by some of them or forget which ones stand for what. So we thought we'd throw these out here at the beginning because we will probably refer to them throughout the presentation. But when we talk about market rate housing, that's unsubsidized. That is whatever it will go for on the fair open market. No matter what type of housing that is, that it could be duplex, quads, triplex apartments. It is just market rate. Affordable housing is considered subsidized in some way and based on income, the income of the person who or family that is using it. And then the term middle housing is used, that can be referred to single family homes, duplexes, triplexes, cottage clusters, and townhomes. So that can refer to any different type, but and those definitions are tied back to House Bill 2001 and SB 458. And just to remind you too, that House Bill 2001 is the one where it prevents any local governments from having single-family home development. So, for instance, in my neighborhood, single-family home, there's going to be some 2 quadplexes going up just catty corner from my house, and it's a single-family neighborhood. The state law, House Bill 2001, is the law that forbade us from saying we just want a single-family home subdivision. So it takes away that local control. That was for, I believe, city's population of 25,000 or more.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just add just a little bit. I mean, you hear the term middle housing a lot. We've been hearing that a lot for several years now. And, you know, I think there was a lot of articles when they were going through the rulemaking process, like there was headlines, the death of single-family zoning. And Mr. Brown is right, it kind of was the death of single-family zoning because essentially what the state did is they reached in to local controls, frankly, and said, hey, within the single-family zone. So we didn't go and rezone Kaiser. We still are like 70-some% single-family zoned, but we have to allow in the single-family zone those middle housing types. And, you know, it's kind of like there was it was an article written by somebody that coined the term the missing middle housing. I don't remember who it was, but some years ago, the missing middle housing. So it's not the truly dense multifamily development, but it's also not the detached single-family home on its individual lot. It's the duplexes, the triplexes, the quadplexes, the townhomes. And so the state in House Bill 2001 said, hey, if you're a city of 25,000, you have to allow duplex on the same lot that you would allow a single-family home. And then depending on lot size, if your lot's, in Kaiser's case, if your lot's 5,000 square feet, you can build a triplex. If it's 7,000 square feet, you can build a quadplex or a cottage cluster development. And then they also threw in a whole bunch of rules around townhomes and said, hey, cities cannot require a larger lot size than 1,500 square feet. You cannot require a larger lot width than 20 feet for townhomes. And basically said you have to allow those outright within your residential single-family home. And further, you cannot apply your adopted density standards that might or might not exist in your comprehensive plan. So in Kaiser, generally our single-family zone has an 8 unit per acre maximum density, but that can only apply to detached single-family dwellings because middle housing, we are not allowed to apply a density standard anymore. So just kind of too much information, but I've been living House Bill 2001 for a while. So I just wanted to add that, so.
Yes, that was our plan.
Oh, and then the other thing I was going to add, Senate Bill 458 was kind of a sister piece of legislation that got pushed through along with House Bill 2001 that then gave the allowance for if a duplex is built or a triplex is built or any middle housing type, which, cottage clusters, whatever, that you can go in and you'd be able to divide those individual units into separately owned pieces of property without having to meet any of the city's requirements for lot size or dimensions or anything like that. You just have to basically demonstrate that they can be served with utilities and meet the building code. So that's what Senate Bill 458 refers to there. I just wanted to clarify that because we didn't really give any explanation. I think I was supposed to tell you that, so.
Yeah,
Questions so far? Councilor Kolar has a question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Brown, Mr. Witham, so did it prohibit single-family developments, really? It just says that you have
No,
one, you can't keep somebody from putting this or that in the middle of it.
correct. That's correct. And that's why I wanted to kind of clarify that because it didn't say you can't build single-family homes. It said that as a city, you cannot restrict your zoning to only that housing type. And so for most of my career here, single-family zone allowed single-family homes. It would allow some zero lot line development, and it would allow duplexes on corner lots over 7,500 square feet. That's been on the books since like 98. And we allowed some shared housing, which isn't technically middle housing. So ADUs are not middle housing, even though it seems like it's middle housing. I know, it's confusing. But so yeah, it does not prohibit it, but it does prohibit cities regulating it to require it. So.
so our challenge is there's a strong financial incentive, just looking at the economics of it, why we're seeing it play out in these single-family, predominantly single-family neighborhoods where there's an opportunity to sell 2 units instead of 1. And most developers would rather get 2 than 1. So there's lots of examples like that we can point to around Kaiser right now. Okay, so the other, the last definition there is workforce housing, and that just refers to the level of the housing size that the level of the workforce you are serving. So that could mean all the different types. So we're single-family homes and duplexes and apartments. It refers to whatever residence you have and the housing style and size that fits them.
Yeah, and as well as income. I mean, it's a little bit of a term of art that's become much more popular in the last handful of years to talk about essentially right-sized housing in both design type, but also for the income brackets that you're serving in your community.
Yeah. I wish I could sit here and tell you that these terms are all mutually exclusive, but they're not. They all overlap each other, and it's not really a clean definition of any of them.
So I do have one question before you go to the next slide, and that's another housing term used, and that's low-income housing. Low-income housing and affordable housing are not this, again, we're talking about that mishmash of terms. That's different also. Doesn't that have definitions?
Well, I think it depends. Affordable housing is regulated and subsidized, and so most of the time, if you have true affordable housing, you're going to have actual like deed restrictions on it, which we'll talk a little bit later. But like for example, in the one-time UGB expansion legislation that was passed, I think it's 30% of your expansion area has to actually be true affordable housing with a 60-year restriction saying it will be guaranteed for that. But there is, it's funny, Adam and I talked about like, oh, should we put some more terms in here? And honestly, it is hard because it does muddy the waters, but there is, there's some of the terms that have been used in previous studies, things like naturally occurring affordable housing. Oftentimes, people consider manufactured home parks to be in that category. There's obviously it becomes kind of a function of what is the housing, who is the housing serving based on the income profile of the folks that are living there. So I think there's certain housing types that may be marketed towards a lower income bracket, and those maybe end up being low income housing, but not necessarily regulated in the same way that true affordable housing is. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but that might be about the best I can do on that. So,
If I could reflect back to see if what I heard is what you said. So low-income housing is a subset of affordable housing with the idea that you have a specific matchup of the low income, that's the 30% AMI, which is what the average median income or lower, and that the cost of that housing matching that income specifically.
yeah, I think that's correct.
Okay.
I'm not positive on the number, on the AMI numbers, on where the break is or where they put those categories. I think we could probably get that information.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, so when we're talking about regulation too, I don't know, I think, was this you that came up with this term, the ambiguity of how and where? Actually, I think it's a really good term. It came up with it as we were talking, working on this morning. So one of the regulations that we have to consider is farmland. In other cities, it might be forest land, but the state regulates that we have to add lower quality soils before we add higher quality soils. This data, this map that you see in front of you shows the northeast side of Kaiser, and the property in purple is our high quality soil, and even the green is high quality soil if it's drained. It's wet areas. So you can see that on the northeast side of us, that's one of our challenges, is that it is prime farmland. And as many of you told me when I moved here, that we have some of the best soil in the country, right, all around us. So,
Got to grow them hops. Councilor Kohler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Brown, who was it that determined that each of these areas was the prime farmland? Is that particular study, or did they talk to some farmers, or how did they come up with that determination?
Sure, it's from, I'll actually answer that because I'm the one that got the map. I called up Marion County and I asked them for a soils map, and so they sent that over to our GIS tech and he created a map for us. So it's based on the actual soils that are there. In another layer, there's some data about, there's like names of soils. I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't know what any of them mean, but there was kind of some different symbology on it. So, sorry, a little bit of a rabbit trail, but currently if you're out in a county, like Marion County or Lynn or whatever county you're in, and you want to apply to do things with your property and you're maybe on an EFU zoned land or a farm forest zoned land, you would have to normally do like a site assessment first, which they'll actually do some soil sampling and look at soils maps to determine where you could site buildings or structures. I know a little bit more about this than I want because of my wife's grandmother's property out in Lyons, and she passed away, and the family asked, hey, Shane, you're a planner. Why don't you look at this and see what our options are? So I spent a little time diving into that and talking with the planners at Marion County. And I'm not a county planner. My career has been here, city planning, so I don't have a ton of expertise in this area. So I think ultimately what we want to express with the map is we know that we have farmlands all around us. That's why the UGBs were drawn the way they were in the 70s. They kind of looked at existing development patterns and soil types. And so they drew those boundaries accordingly and kind of kept the good farmland out, because kind of Oregon land use planning in its inception was in order to protect sprawl or prevent sprawl and protect farm and forest lands. So anyway, all that to say, I think that realistically, and we'll get into it a little bit later, with any proposed amendment to a UGB, there's a whole slew of rules that you would have to do some site assessments. So I think that ultimately there would have to be some additional studying done in this area to really get deep into it. I talked with planning or community development director in McMinnville, and they did a UGB expansion back in 2020 after a remand after like 26 years. But I know that she talked about the fact that they had first expanded onto type 3 and 4 soils, but then those were gone, and so then they were to the 1 and the 2s, which the 1 and the 2s are the best of the best. So we don't have that data in this map. We just have that as prime farmland. So I do not know if these are type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4 soils. What I do know is that the state says don't expand onto farmlands as your first. We want you to expand elsewhere first. So that's kind of what the crux of it is that's one of those challenge points that we've always had in Kaiser, is that we're surrounded by farmland. So hopefully that helps answer that a little bit.
Follow up?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for that, Mr. Witham. One of the interesting things that I've tried to do is actually visit with some farmers and say, what do you think we should do? And I've been told by a couple different farmers that said, look, there's some land out there that's pretty marginal that we really should be putting some homes or something else on. But yeah, we do have some really good farmland. So I look at that and I think somebody that's been farming that piece of ground would know a whole lot better where we ought to be than somebody that looks at a map and says, oh, look, this is purple here, you can't touch that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad Shane said it the way he did, because we don't want to say that it is impossible here. We just want to say it's going to be a hurdle to overcome. And it's like in the McMinnville case, they tried the 3s and 4s, and that wasn't it wasn't working for what they wanted, the use they wanted to do, so they had to go to the 1s and 2s. So the moral of the story is you have to start with the worst ones, and if doesn't make sense, then you get to go to those. But it's not impossible, just it's a challenge that we'll have to overcome if we decide to do that.
Council President Starr?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So in Councilor Kohler's example, if one of the farmers that said it's marginal farmland, what if that landowner, that farmer, decided they wanted to put houses on it? Like, does that give us the ability to annex it in, or how does that work?
Well, so not without a UGB expansion first.
Okay.
So the UGB itself kind of governs where houses can go. Now there are some areas in the county that are zoned like agricultural residential, or maybe it's residential agricultural. So there's some different zoning designations in the county that have residential uses on them, depending on what the county's comprehensive plan calls for. And obviously there's processes that, those farmers, if they were already there from an expediency and a time point of view, my recommendation would probably be like, hey, you should be going and talking to the county and see if you can do something, because a UGB amendment and process and bringing it in and serving it is like, it's a years-long process, not a months-long process. But that would be what you'd kind of have to do. But it is hard because the EFU zone is pretty locked down. And I won't even get into, Councilor Kohler and I might have had this discussion before. I'm not going to get into the discussion about, well, is grass seed really farming? Is, a vineyard really farming? I'm not going to get into that part of it, right? The rules themselves speak to the soils maps and the soils types and the potential for farming.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So what I'm hearing is that even if somebody who owned that farmland decided, or just it's kind of time to do something different, it would be a years-long process for them to decide if they wanted to put houses on it. It would be That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, I mean,
And that's if we have somebody that wants to do it.
yes, so it would be like the step one would be expand the UGB, get that acknowledged, get through, if you have court cases, if you have challenges from like Friends of Marion County or Thousand Friends groups, there's some kind of land use watchdogs around the state that generally go around and do kind of appeal most land use UGB expansions when it's onto farmland. So you'd have to get through that process first, and then you'd be able to annex those in and zone those for your actual city use. Like I said, there may be possibilities, and again, not a county planner, so I apologize, I just don't know. But like in Kaiser, if somebody has a property that's zoned for commercial use and they want to rezone it to industrial use, we have a process for that called a comprehensive plan and zone change, and they would go through the steps with Planning Commission and then ultimately to council, and also there's notice requirements to the state of Oregon that has to acknowledge those changes, and then those can get done. I mean, it's probably like a 6 months process if it's a fast one. And that might be an option for that farmer outside of the UGB. They would need to talk to the planners at the county, though, about process and what the possibilities would be. As I said, I had a conversation with the community development director in McMinnville just because I wanted to get a little more information, because I know they expanded like 900 acres onto farmlands, a kind of similar situation that we have. They don't have a shared UGB, so that's a big difference. They clearly could demonstrate need, but it was a process that started in the late 90s. They filed it in, I think, 2001, she told me, and then for 12 years, it went back and forth through the courts and to the Court of Appeals. They ended up with a remand order to deal with an assignment of error, and at that time, the folks kind of just set it. And then this particular person came over from a different city who had dealt with urban reserves and some different things in Oregon land use planning and was charged with, hey, what can we do? And so ultimately in 2020, they did complete that approved expansion of bringing land in. And I said, well, how much stuff has actually gotten developed? And the answer was none. So none of it's been actually developed yet in that expansion area. So it's a time, it sucks a lot, or it can suck a lot of time. I know, and I'm getting a little rabbit traily. Adam, I told you if you need to just tell me to be quiet, you do it. But in the cost of growth study we did years ago, we kind of looked at a few different cities around Oregon who'd done expansions, and I think Woodburn is one we're all real familiar with. That was another one. It took them like over 20 years to get their expansion all done. So it's hard. The track record does show a pretty long time frame for making it happen. I think that the track record, I think that the time frame can be a lot smaller if you can check all the boxes really easy. And I think what's hard for us is when we've looked at these options in the past, we don't have an easy way to check all the boxes easily. So it's just, we need to be aware that there's some challenges that we have. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well said, Shane. Appreciate that. Another ambiguity is, well, they will send you back, and we'll show on the next slide, but this is another example off of Bear, and where they will make sure that the city has maximized the property that you already have within the city boundaries. And so we see developments like this. This is Danielle Lane off of O'Neill, and you see a driveway with 4 houses kind of crammed in there. There's examples of that all over the city that we can point to. That was just one that's easy for me to remember because I pass it every day. And so, Shane, why don't you talk about this? This is the traditional UGB plan process, but with showing you how this efficiency thing can.
Yeah, so basically this kind of gives a high level kind of snapshot of how UGBs, why they're there, what we're supposed to do. State law requires cities to plan for a 20-year supply of land for the housing and for the jobs in your city. It's called Goal 9 and Goal 10 of the Oregon Land Use Planning rules. I think they're just called rules. So kind of step one is determining that land need. And we'll get into that a little bit deeper in future slides, but the bottom line is you have to do work to determine your land need. And that land need is going to be determined on your housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory. The one that we currently have that's adopted was from 2013. We updated it in 2018, but then re-updated it in 2021 technically, because they were changing some stuff and we were getting an actual defined population number specific for Kaiser. We did not adopt that one in 2021 for a number of reasons that we don't need to get into tonight, but just know that we didn't technically adopt it. However, it was very different than the 2013 study. A big piece was because of populations, which we will talk about in a moment. But so you determine how much land you need to accommodate the population growth for housing needs and as well as for job lands. And then you need to look at what your existing land supply is and how much of that growth can fit within your existing boundaries. And then you get to analyze and revise the capacity within the existing UGB and implement what the state terms as efficiency measures. And so efficiency measures could be, well, okay, you don't have enough land, but you've got this giant lot size, so you need to lower your lot size, or you need to increase allowable densities, or you need to allow additional housing types. You may need to upzone or rezone parcels, and these are, generally optional. Or if you can't do any of those things, or the efficiency measures can't accommodate that projected growth that you're planning for in the 20-year horizon, it's either do different zoning or expand the UGB. You've got to do something. So what's very interesting is in 2013, when we did our update, it was actually after we were in a thing called periodic review, which doesn't exist anymore. There used to be this thing called periodic review that the state would periodically review local governments to make sure they were doing their job to plan for future needs of land and that they were managing their land supply correctly. They kind of abandoned that and now have put out more of a schedule of when we have to do updates to our housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventories, or now they're calling them housing capacity analysis, excuse me. So in 2008, there was a shared product that had to be done because we're a shared UGB, and we were in periodic review, and then we said, okay, we need to do a refined Kaiser specific. So we did an economic opportunities analysis to look at job lands, and we did a housing needs analysis to look at housing. And so that was in 2013. We adopted those things. In those studies, it said we need 267 acres of residential land. There was some parkland need, some school land need, some other stuff that kind of goes along with housing. And then aspirationally, because of a targeted, kind of a 5-target industries approach for our economic needs, we said we needed 63.3 acres. So ultimately we needed, 350-ish, I think, acres of land in 2013. So normally you would submit all that to DLCD. If we weren't connected to Salem, we would have submitted that all to DLCD and they'd say, okay, Kaiser, how are you going to deal with this? What efficiency measures are you going to implement? Show us what you've done to increase your capacity, and then come back to us and tell us really what you're doing. Or file a UGB amendment, and that'll put it into the review process of have you implemented enough efficiency measures. Instead, they sent us a letter that said, thank you. And I was not in charge by any stretch of the means. I was like 3 positions ago, but the folks I worked with, who were my bosses, we all kind of scratched our head. And the ultimate crux of it was there was nothing that we needed to do because the shared UGB did not show a need for any of the housing or job land needs because the region could support the overall growth in that 20-year horizon. And so now, out of that, I would say this, my predecessors were not irresponsible. We have been doing infill development since, 2000. Like for 20 some years, we've been doing infill development. And so personally, I feel that we have implemented a lot of efficiency measures in Kaiser. Now, they might not technically have been called that or triggered by a DLCD review, but I do think that at some level, we can demonstrate that Kaiser has been responsible with its land supply and implemented efficiency measures all along the way. So, I don't know, that was kind of a ramble. I apologize. It's just...
And the nice thing is, I mean, we're seeing the council was great in adopting and taking the direction of the River Cherry overlay. And so those things are naturally occurring in the areas that the way the state would like to see them. We see that happening on River Road, things coming down and things coming back up that are more dense. We just didn't need the state to tell us to do that. It's just happening economically.
Council President Starr?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. You can probably guess what I'm going to ask.
Why didn't we adopt it?
Well, I know you said for reasons we don't need to go
You
into
want me to dive
tonight,
into 'em?
so
Okay.
I'm assuming we're going to get a follow-up because I'm sure.
We can dive into them a little bit.
Like-
So there was a few factors that happened. So the numbers got updated kind of right in the heart of COVID. It was 2020 census numbers that brought those updates. The other thing that happened in there is so in 2013, we did not have to do this. And we were trying originally to get our housing needs analysis updated and adopted in like 2018 because a new rule went into effect that said, hey, if you adopt after, I think it was 2020, then within a year, you have to adopt what's called a housing production strategy to show us how you're going to do that. So you have to get like funding for that work, which we kind of didn't have. We also, at that time when all of this kind of rolled out, we also didn't have a city manager. And then we also had some pretty good concerns that were raised by council and planning commission. We had a couple joint work sessions when we were going through our housing needs analysis work. And so there were quite a few question marks there. And in the midst of all of this, the state is, okay, I'll be careful how I say this. Like the state does their job, right? But the state kind of has been changing how things historically have been done, and they keep making new rules and new standards. And so there was a lot of question mark on what that was going to mean for us. Ultimately, and I don't know if I said this, I think I told you the numbers for the 2013 number. I don't think we put this in a slide. But when we talk about need for housing, just residential land need, not including, parks or schools or any of that, but for housing in 2013, we said we needed 267 acres. Technically it ended up being a 2021 draft when the draft was all finalized, but also the 2018 study, it didn't change much. It ended up being a need of 52 acres.
I'm sorry,
5.2. 5.2. So a very small need, very small. And so realistically, I think there was a little bit of a, if that were to have been adopted at that time, we would be sitting on an official document that says, all you need is 52 acres. I don't think everybody maybe was comfortable with that at that time, and we were not required to adopt anything at that time. So there was some questions asked of me as, what if we don't adopt it? Well, then we don't adopt it. We will have to adopt it, and was going to have to be by the end of this year. But because of some other legislative changes, they have pushed our deadline out where we will have to adopt an updated housing capacity analysis in 2027 and a housing production strategy to follow by the end of 2028. So that was, and they were kind of in the midst of basically moving the bar around is the way I feel, but maybe it's just because I live it.
Great.
So
Thank you.
does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah.
And if I may, there was also in that conversation, what would the housing production strategy require of the city? What was it going to do to potentially to the taxpayers? It obligated us to something that we didn't have resources to handle. without going out to our tax base and going, this is what we are going to be dealing with as possibly an unfunded mandate. So there were a lot of those questions in the mix at the same time, and the awareness that we were in the midst of the climate-friendly, equitable communities and other rules and things like that were changing. So there was a lot of chaos in that. This is my brain. I remember one of the big questions was, what will be our obligation?
Yeah. No, I think that's accurate. And the other thing, and I know like in the packet materials we sent out kind of a list of relevant studies with links to those that are on our website that had dates associated with them. So the other piece that was happening, it's hard. I think back and I was like, man, it was really busy. We adopted our River Cherry Overlay District and the Kaiser Revitalization Plan at kind of the end of 2018. We did a cost of growth workshop that was kind of looking to a little, I won't call it a cost benefit analysis, but at the time council had questions on what does this mean? What does this cost the city? They felt like there was a need to kind of have more information to make an educated decision on how maybe to move forward or not move forward. So we had that cost of growth study in 2018. We had the cost of growth on the transportation study that ended up being finalized in October of 2020. And so all this work was kind of happening at the same time to try to get to, okay, what does it mean for us? And so, like I said, ultimately the housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory work kind of just said, okay, we're going to hit pause on this for right now. So.
One more question, if I could, just to kind of put it in context. Then House Bill 2001 and 2003 that dealt with the changes in single-family residential and so forth, that all happened after that, didn't it?
Yeah.
Or was that the same time?
I think 2001 might have been the 2019 legislative session. I know that I had to adopt middle housing changes to the rules by June of
Kyle, do you remember?
22. Yeah. I think we had to have the adopted rules for middle housing in June of 2022. I believe we've had them in place for a little over 2 years now.
So this kind of also overlapped or mishmashed in between these studies.
Yes.
And then the state rules.
Yeah, and for sure with the middle housing, because in our HNA work that we did, that was one of the tweaks that we had to make midstream, is we had to take into consideration when you're looking at land supply, where before, pretty easy to look at, single lot, single home, you can count units. And so in that update work, there was a recognition that our housing supply would be shifting a little bit more towards middle housing. And I believe in the math, I'm a planner, not an engineer guy, so math is not my strength. But in the math, I believe the state, even though it wasn't officially anywhere in like any rule, they kind of gave like this safe harbor provision of 3% of the projected dwelling units could be assigned to middle housing redevelopment kind of stuff that we had to do in that work, if I remember right. So.
Another area that the state regulates that you have to address is the availability and ability for expansion areas to receive public utilities and services like fire, sewer, roads, things like that. So just another thing we have to, that the state requires us to look at. Exception lands is something that you've undoubtedly heard of. And so, for the public's sake, education's sake, these are the exception lands in yellow and red. This is up between Clear Lake Road, River Road, and what's that, the backside of O'Neill? There's actually...
Well, there's like a private drive, like Priest Lane or Priest Drive.
Yeah. So, and then of course, north side of Clear Lake Lane, and then also a little bit to the west of River, past Quinnaby. So those are lands that have to be brought in before a UGB is expanded. So in other words, those are the first ones you should look at, and they would also require that you address the density and need. So I don't know. Do you want to add anything to that? It's a-
Yeah. So this is kind of one of the issues with your kind of classic urban growth boundary expansion. Those exception lands are supposed to come in as a part of that expansion area. I personally do have maybe more questions than I have answers on what exactly that means. I know it would need to come in. I know there are some safe harbor provisions to say, hey, if there's a house you carve out, I think it's a half an acre is the max you can carve out around it. It might actually be a quarter. I did some back of the napkin math. Again, math not my strength. I used some, very accurate Google Earth imagery to try to calculate what that area is. And I actually went through and looked at the tax parcels and added stuff up with a calculator. And basically that land is somewhere to the tune of, I think it's about between 160 and 180 acres total, with about 95 different property owners. So if the safe harbor provision is a half an acre around each piece, that equates to a little less than 50 acres of developed land, which means we would have to assume that the rest of that is redevelopable. What I don't know, and I think it would depend on if you actually filed that UGB expansion and did the work on the site assessment piece, you would be able to look at the site by site and make some assumptions or some, how would I put it? You'd basically be able to make your argument of, hey, yes, that can come in, but maybe this isn't developable because of A, B, and C. But ultimately, if we're representing we have a 52-acre need and there's well over 100 acres of developable land, it could very well mean, the exception lands come in and you're done. So it may not be super shovel ready or real likely to redevelop, which is a little bit of a challenge when you're looking at the exception lands piece. The other thing with exception lands that's can be hard or has been hard in other places is oftentimes the folks that live there aren't super excited about coming into a UGB. Other times they are. I happen to know that in this area, there's at least one property owner that calls every once in a while asking about coming in because they have some issues with the existing failing septic system. And they would really love to hook up to city services. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And I know towards the end of the presentation, we're going to get into kind of the engagement piece. But I think this is something that has been talked about a bit. We did talk about it in, I think, our strategic planning workshop stuff that we did, where I would view it as maybe kind of important to have some conversations with those property owners in that exception land area as a part of the overall conversation on, do we want to push out and grow to the north and expand? But again, that is not my call, but it is one of those things there. Those property owners could be a source of contention in the overall UGB process. I know, like I said, with my conversation with the McMinnville Community Development Director, they said, with all their court stuff that they went through for years, there was one specific property owner that was very anti-growth and expansion at all, and as well as the Thousand Friends group there. And so they kind of jointly appealed every step of the way. So if you end up having somebody in that area that's of that mindset, it probably behooves us as a city to maybe kind of know that ahead of time or have some of those conversations.
We've got questions from Council President Starr.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. What is the difference between the red areas and the yellow areas?
Yeah, excuse me. The red is some commercial stuff. So that's like the hitching post, and so it's just different zoning as what it's built. I think the yellow is all residential agricultural rural. That sounds weird.
Good question.
I'm going to go Councilor Kohler, and then I'll go Councilor Reed.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Now, I understand that there are some city services stubbed out to some of that area.
I don't think there are services stubbed to it. I know that, right? There's not. Yeah, generally you can't extend services beyond an urban growth boundary. There is a trunk line that runs. No, not north of Country Glen.
Not outside the UGB.
Okay. Just right at that edge.
But it's at the edge of the UGB.
Water is at the edge of the UGB, sewer is near the edge of the UGB in most locations. State law indicates you cannot provide city services outside of the urban growth boundary, city services meaning water and sewer primarily, except for parkland. Kaiser Rapids Park, served by water, has been for a number of years. It's now inside the urban growth boundary, but it was served with city water before it was inside the urban growth boundary, because that's one thing that can be served.
I think they had a similar thing with the Oregon Garden years ago to do something like that as well.
Well, Councilor Reed?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, have we had any even preliminary sort of conversations with the owners that would be wanting to develop? Because the whole purpose of expanding the UGB in this sense would be to develop it. But these are some pretty luxury lots, and the people that I know that are in those areas are there because they want land. And have we had any kind of?
No, we've not had discussions with the folks in the exception land areas as of yet.
Because there would, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's really no point in expanding the UGB there if it's not for the purpose of development?
I would not disagree with that statement. I mean, I think that is kind of the point of UGBs, is to provide the appropriate land supply for what your needs are. So yeah, that.
But, if I may,
Oh, a follow-up, of course.
but this being the first step, this exceptional lands would be the first step. So theoretically, if we expanded the UGB to serve these areas in terms of services, that would open the door for other parts of the non-exception lands to be expanded into.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to kind of get at, as far as when you project out what your need is, and then you file a UGB amendment, you're needing to justify, I'm bringing in these lands, I'm going to assume a certain density for these lands to redevelop. That's going to be a math equation to figure out how much of the need is taken care of by this, and then how much additional land is needed to take care of the remaining balance of that need. Again, when we were talking about, 400 acres of needed land, you're talking about the exception lands area and probably 200 plus acres of additional land that we thought we needed, from 2013 up until 2021, that we would have to do something, and we would need that much on the basis of the math. That math changed, and so now the need is much less, and so it is difficult. But yeah, I mean, the reality is the state would look at it and say, you need to bring in the exception lands as first, because those are lands that, even if they were considered EFU lands, but if they're designated as exception lands because they're already developed with a bunch of housing, those are what should come in versus eating up prime big tract farmland. So it does kind of go back to a little bit of a cart and a horse of, what's the need versus what you have out there that you can expand onto. Does that help?
Yeah, just one more follow-up. So we don't have to guarantee that anybody's going to actually develop up there, as long as they're developable. That would be our due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a future slide that there's a little new wrinkle with a thing called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that I don't know what that means for us in the future quite yet. But yes, generally from the deck that has been set that I know, you plan for capacity on the basis of what your projected need is and what your land supply is. I think a way to highlight it is just an example is I get a lot of phone calls right now. I don't know you guys knew this, but Shane apparently is the guy in Kaiser who wants all the multifamily housing. I don't have a dog in the fight, folks. I just official record, don't have a dog in the fight at all. But a lot of the properties that we've seen redevelop with multifamily products in the last 2-3 years, there's only one that had a zone change done on it. Everything else was zoned and they built exactly to what has been allowed to be built there since 1998 at least. So those, when we did our housing needs analysis in 2013, for example, we assumed that there would be a certain level of redevelopment, and it's hard because you're aggregating a lot of acreage, so it is not site to site like mathematics done to the fine line. I think when you're looking at doing a UGB expansion, it may behoove an entity to have a really good consultant and smarter people than Shane to look at those things at a more gradient level, a more site to site, to look at, okay, really what kind of usable land do we have that we would be working with in those areas? I mean, that would be my suggestion if that were, moving forward, if we were going that direction. So does that help, Councilor Reed, on explaining that a little bit? Clear as mud, maybe?
Yes, thank you.
I've got a question, then I'm going to go to Councilor Duran. So one thing I heard you say, make sure I'm reflecting this correctly, is that just because something is zoned a particular way doesn't mean that it's going to develop tomorrow. You just said that in 1998, we adopted our comprehensive plan, the basic one, but we have apartments going in now and people are going, oh my gosh, how did this happen? But it has been zoned that way since 1998.
Yep.
So two things. One, that had been planned for, and number two, just because somebody's property is zoned some way doesn't mean they have to do anything with it. They can sit on it.
That
And
is
so when the state is looking at our comp plan, they're looking at the zoning, they're not looking at actual production, because we can't make anybody do anything,
correct.
correct?
Yes, that's 100% correct, with that caveat of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis and this new requirement where we do have to adopt a housing production strategy kind of gets into what kind of housing are you producing. The OHNA, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, or ONA as people call it, that definitely gets into that because that's driven by the governor's desire to produce X amount of housing units throughout the state of Oregon. Like I said,
Yeah.
Sorry,
So press,
I'm-
we'll
I'm off the rails.
We'll hold on to that
I
for that one
apologize.
for just a sec, because that is, coming attractions. But that goes back to the question about 21 when we press pause, because I remember we had this conversation about what is going to be the obligation to the people of Kaiser. Is this an unfunded mandate?
Yeah.
And in 21, if anybody remembers back then, we had a little bit of chaos going on. So there was that. I'm going to go to Councilor Duran, follow up with one more question from Councilor Kohler, and then we're going to get back on track.
Okay, I'll make mine quick. So a lot of this property in the exceptions land, I know quite a few homeowners in there, and they've threatened me if I vote on this, so it. No,
Oh, dear.
just in jest, most of them want their big properties. They have large properties for a reason. And some of that property I had looked at buying quite a few years ago, and there's a lot of water down there in the back of those properties on River Road. So really, a lot of that land is not buildable, and that would be an issue. I mean, I'd say probably 20% of that area between River Road and, Neal area there.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think, and those are, Councilor Duran, I think you're speaking to, and it's hard, like I said, I think that's where part of that site analysis, looking at those expansion areas and actually having alternatives of you expand here or you expand there, and you kind of weigh it out and you submit, here's what we're doing and why, that definitely would be a factor that you would go into there, because you would also, if there was floodplains that were mapped, floodplains aren't developable, you're not going to go into those areas. So there are quite a few locational factors that can come in and kind of like push those numbers around.
Right.
And by no means, when I did my kind of like quick back of the napkin, that's just 100% intending to be illustrative, whatever. But, it definitely is not like hey, we've looked at all of this. Because honestly, on those 95 properties, I don't know if there's a house on every one of them. Maybe some are vacant, maybe some are not. Depending on where a house sits, that may make a difference on how you carve that thing up and you take your safe harbor provision of what the state allows and say, okay, this is developable, but maybe because dimensions, this whole thing's off the board. So I think there is definitely, I think what I wanted to make the point of is when you're looking at, having 160 to 180 acres, because I also have a question on, well, do we get to like net area that out and remove every road and every private access, or do we have to go with the bigger, grander look? I actually don't know the answer to that. But when you look at it, like the reality is that there's some capacity there. We don't know how much. And again, that need piece is a hard one for us to get around when we have such a small need now. So,
We would have, if this would have been annexed in, if we would have been able to do this in 2016, there'd have been a lot of land available in that area. But since then, there's been houses put in. Pretty much every 2-acre lot now has a house.
Yeah.
And it's right in the middle of the lot. So
Yep.
it makes it difficult to increase the.
exactly what I would do if I owned one
Right.
of them.
I actually looked at like 4 of those lots in there for myself. And I was interested in buying a lot to be close to Kaiser and have 2 to 4 acres. So that's a big, this chunk of property is a problem for reality of getting built.
Yes.
If we're stuck with adding that in and that's all we get to add in, we're going to get a fraction of what we need out of that. So that was just basically my comment, is it's really tough to say, oh, here's a great chunk of property, because it's really not going to benefit us.
Counselor Kohler?
Wow, you said it very well, thank you. That's kind of what I was going to say. There's a lot of people, if you drive through that area, there's houses on almost all of that land.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there wouldn't be that many opportunities for additional housing. There would be some, but there's an area just above, is it Cross River Road from the Meadows? There's some area over there that at one point was earmarked for annexation or something, wasn't it?
Well, so I have to be a little bit careful about how I explain this. Bill Lawyer might be able to help me out because he's been around longer than me. My understanding is that way back in the early 90s, when Country Glen was developed, there was something that the city needed easement-wise or something from that property owner for some public facilities for that subdivision. And I know I've seen the letter. It's been years ago. Our previous city attorney affectionately referred to it as a Wally deal. And so there was a previous city manager from, I was a city manager when I first started working here, but that was a very long time ago, like 25-ish years ago. There was an indication to that property owner that when the city expands the UGB, you would be the first to come in. That's the Shane paraphrase of the crux of that. Of course, that was like kind of a promise and a statement that maybe that person didn't have the power to make, but for many years, that specific property owner, who no longer owns it, is a new property owner that owns it now, from my understanding, they would come in and chat with us often about when's the city going to expand the UGB? When's the city going to expand the UGB? And so that kind of ebbs and flows with the market. The discussion has ebbed and flowed with the market and housing affordability over the years as well. So there was even some discussion at one point that they had engaged with my predecessor that maybe they would actually come and sue the city to force something different to happen. And ultimately, if we had a need for land and the city was refusing to do anything to address that need, you can see that around the state of Oregon, where like home builders associations will come in and be like, hey, you've got to do something. The difference for us with the shared UGB is nobody can actually point and say, hey, there's a need in the region to do something. If Salem was built out like we're built out, it would be a completely different conversation that was being had, because a UGB expansion would be happening in our region, and it would ultimately be, my guess is, there would be a lot of discussion amongst electeds on where is this growth going to go. But because we're not there and haven't been there yet, it's a very different spot that we find ourselves in versus our region.
So I don't want to keep going down that rabbit trail, but the Wally Mall letter is news to me. I did not know about this, and I would like to follow up with understanding what that was. Are there any legal obligations that were enforceable? And to get more information on that, because I had no idea that way back in the day, somebody had made a promise that, last time I checked, the city manager back then was not a spokesperson for DLCD.
I can just assure the council that that level of tying the future hands of other councils usually is not recognized under Oregon law. So I would say we're on pretty safe legal ground that wouldn't be binding, but I will look into it and get back to you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, shall we move on from exceptions?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier about the state requiring multiple studies as you go into an expansion if you're using this traditional route. Population projections are a part of that. The next slide will talk a little bit about what's changed with population projections. But then also data tied to these three studies, the buildable lands inventory, housing needs analysis, and the economic opportunities analysis. And then also adhering to State Goal 14 that prioritizes rural exception lands and designated for farm or forest use. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The population estimates, we are required to use Portland State University population estimates. We used to be able to kind of participate in the development of that, and but of more recently, the state has said you have to use PSU's population estimates, and we don't really have much of a say in it. Do you want to elaborate on?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty accurate. There was something that got changed in the rules. It used to be a coordinated population forecast for our region, which is what those 2013 numbers were based on. And then the LCD effectively got the rules changed to say now you're going to use Portland State's Population Research Center. And in the early days of those, we would only get a number for our whole UGB. So there was no differentiation of, well, what's the Kaiser number? What's the Salem area number? It was just one number. And that's actually one of the reasons why in the 2018 update to the HNA, we were able to refresh it in 2020, ending in 2021, because that was the first time we were able to get a Kaiser-specific number that required some work and lobbying on, I'm not sure who did it, but somebody got the state to get more money so that they would pay Portland State so it would give a number actually for Kaiser. I don't know if that was somebody up there or if it was my predecessor or the city manager or who, but somehow it ended up happening. But we asked for it for a long time because as a city, we were like, well, how are we supposed to plan for our city if all we're saying is it's a region? Like, this doesn't make sense. So, but yeah, there was a lot around 2020, I went to a lot of webinars about population projections and how they were deriving it. And I would just say this, there's a lot of question marks on the black box that is the population projections. They talk about a lot of factors that go into it, and it spits out a number. But I don't think there's anybody around the state that necessarily thinks it's exactly accurate. Most consultants will lead off with saying, hey, the first thing to know about population projections is they're always going to be wrong. So, but you have to kind of go with a educated best, more than a guess, but that's kind of where we're at.
And it then gets trued up every decennial census with something that should be more accurate.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, in the old days, it was based on the census, the decennial census. And with this program, they have to refresh those numbers every 4 years. There's now a cycle when they will relook at it. And we are in, I think this 24, 25 is we are in that review process. We're going to get a new number.
Yep.
That's also going to be another data point that we don't know what's going to go into the black box of mishmash of population need and land need. So stay tuned for that number.
So first thing I want to tell you about this slide is that no animals were hurt in the taking of this. But this is a good picture to illustrate that the studies that we have to do kind of have us chase our own tail on it, and that's kind of. So we're, like Shane said earlier, we're required to do a housing needs analysis, required to do economic opportunities analysis, and a buildable lands inventory in following that linear path. But now, more recently, we have thrown on top of it the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which we don't know how that's going to impact the other three items. The thing we
Do you have a question on the?
Just a statement, really. Just to point out that all of these analyses are led through contracted consultants, and it's a long process, it's expensive, and so just wanted to point that out, that this is not something that we just do in-house. These are all things we do with consultants.
Yes, that is for sure. When we've updated our housing needs analysis and economic opportunities analysis and buildable lands inventories in the past, those have generally been accomplished through grant funding. We did apply for a grant this past year, last year, or looked at it, at least for an economic opportunities analysis, but we're not successful in getting that. The council of governments kind of helped us with an application for that to try to update that particular study as well, because it really is it's a big piece of the overall picture. So yeah, it definitely is not something we do in-house. I don't think anybody does it in-house. Maybe some really smart people somewhere do, but Shane's not doing that in-house.
But so I mean, generally, your land types are going to be with housing or some type of economic activity, and those two things together then determine what you need in terms of buildable lands inventory. But this new acronym ONA, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, we do not know what the impact of that will be yet.
And the one thing I might add for ONA, just it's something that we are trying to track the best that we can. In mid-September, they dropped kind of the draft methodology as well as allocations. Essentially, in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, they're kind of allocating out to every city, hey, here's what kind of housing you should be producing in the next 20 years. And so I've kind of looked at that, reviewed that, and there is a difference. With our housing needs analysis we did in 2021, we said, hey, we're going to have to produce like 2,000 and I think 67 units, if I remember the number right. And in the ONA, they're saying, hey, we should be producing like 3,000 and some units. So it's like almost 1,500 more units in ONA in a 20-year look than what our HNA was looking at. What we do know for sure is that when we have to do our housing capacity analysis by the end of 2027, we have to have it adopted. So we should be getting grant funding, hopefully, to get that work kicking off sooner than later. That the ONA rules are going to affect how we do that housing planning work for the long range. So it could have the potential to say, oh, you know what? You actually do need more land. Or it could also say you need to densify even more. I don't know exactly how it's going to kind of fly out the door in the end. And frankly, I've asked our regional rep and talked with the state some, and they're not totally sure yet either. So just for what it's worth, it does create a whole nother layer of questions I can't really answer.
And for those who are wondering where they can see it, the draft methodology is available. We were sent the link, but it's really easy to find, to look at that and see what this is as of September, and of course, this is October, and things can change as they're working through the rulemaking process. we don't know how that's going to turn out. And then there'll be the appeals to the rules and so forth as those try to settle down, and we don't know what will happen. There's more legislation that's floating out there with legislative concepts for the 25, wow, I just got ahead of myself, legislative session. So we're going to have to really keep an eye on that and make sure they don't throw another monkey wrench into the whole mix. So just something to keep in mind.
So what we've talked about all the way up until this point has been trying to work within the shared UGB. The most obvious way to demonstrate a need would be to separate from Salem and have our own urban growth boundary. But we would lose some flexibility with that. So let me kind of explore this a little bit. In 2018, the city asked DLCD for a letter on a path to separate. And what they came back with is said that if all four governing bodies, as in 2 county commissions and the 2 city councils, being Polk, Marion, Salem, Kaiser, came together and unanimously agreed that they wanted to split, then it could happen. In a follow-up call that the Council of Governments put together with myself and DLCD, they added onto that, well, then DLCD would then have to consider it, which was not in the original letter. It was, so that was another hurdle. Let me,
Yep. Council President Starr.
I'm just going to take a deep breath when I ask this question. But who gives the LCD all the power? And I know it's the state, but who in the state? Is it our legislature? Is it our executive branch? Who gives them all the power to say, yes, you know you can't, but yes, you can, that kind of?
I don't know originally when it was established who was, if it was the
I mean, it's-
legislature as a whole or if it was governor. But I know
The Wizard
that-
of Oz behind the curtain.
So, I mean, ultimately in Oregon land use planning, that is like the commission. And then, so there's the Land Conservation Development Commission is like the legislative piece of it. And then there's Department of Land Conservation Development, which is really who I deal with. I don't know if our attorney can speak to that better. I don't know that it was something voted on or if it was more like appointed that said, hey, this is who's going to be in charge of the Oregon land use planning system. I do not know.
I just want to know where they get all the power.
I think part of it is you have a legislature and an executive branch that doesn't mind continuing to make statutes and rules that tend to give them more power. So I think it is sort of a vehicle or a creature of both statutory and then also administrative powers, and the administrative powers coming down more from the executive branch and the legislature. Let me do this though. What I'll do is I'll just go through a quick primer on the actual creation of it and let you know that. But the idea is it seems to be fed by a couple of different branches of government. And I know that in Oregon, there seems to be more interest in the creating a little bit more onerous land use for the purposes of protecting agriculture and forest lands. And so that seems to be the climate with which that operates. But you're right. I mean, we've seen it through rulemaking, through statutory, and through administrative. So it sort of seems to be a harder and harder thing that we have to deal with as a locality. But it's certainly state level, and that's why we wrestle with it so much, is because a lot of things we get preempted by as a local government. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, but I will gladly put together sort of, so I don't just sit here and make it up on the spot. I'll make sure and explain exactly kind of their creation and some of the ways in which it's become a little bit of a behemoth.
Go, Mr. Brown, and then question from Councilor Kohler.
Oh, go ahead with the question. I was just going to continue.
Oh, okay. Councilor Kohler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My years of working with UGB expansion, the most frustrating thing is as soon as you think you have things figured out, the goalposts not only change locations, but change fields.
North Plains just went through that, and I think that is a cautionary tale of the difficulty, even when you think you have every T crossed and every I dotted, then, yeah, the goalpost definitely changed fields for the city of North Plains. So I think we need to be aware of that. And I had something else in mind, but you know what? It probably wasn't that important, so I'm going to go back to Mr. Brown.
Okay. I think we share your exasperation in that. It is frustrating. So what we would add to that, the right legislative support could separate the urban growth area between Salem and Kaiser. We've that would take the right people. It's going outside of that traditional path, but the separation then requires a need for a 20-year land supply. The challenge with that is kind of what I'm trying to graphically display on this next slide. When we're tied together with Salem, we can somewhat decide what mix we have here on the left side. When we split, then we have to be put into this formula-driven, this concoction that spits out that says, well, you're going to need to add not just residential, but we need to add business park, we need to add more commercial mixed use, more agricultural, industrial, and you're going to be subject to that, which would be also a long process to figure out. So we lose control again if we go the split from Salem, whereas now we have some control over what our community looks like.
Just a side question. The other one that got a legislative divorce, for lack of a better word, were Eugene and Springfield. And that started a process that took well over 7 years to split the details, and a tremendous amount of money was spent in separating those elements between the two cities. So a UGB split from on a legislative action only starts a process. It's not a conclusion. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, and that's what we understand. It would probably be 7 to 10 years for all that to figure out. But I know I've heard from several of you on the dais that said if we don't start, then we never get to 10. But so it is a path, but we just want to be aware of the potential outcomes of that path. So let's switch over to the cost of growth, which, talking about that, we broke it into two groups, the fiscal costs, and that's really just looking at the type of services we provide, utilities, transportation, parks, public safety, schools, other services. And in 2020, the city explored two options with a consultant. And one option was that the land on the northeast side of Kaiser would be used for job creation, so expanding the commercial area of Kaiser. And then the other option on the right was using the land on the other side of the LaBiche Ditch, or as most people would know, the Volcano Stadium, the other side of that, as commercial area, and then lands on, or housing development on the rest of it, which would have been a much larger area. So that study resulted in the cost financial impact. The smaller one using developing River Road as business, primarily commercial activity, that's $17 million. And then the larger impact with family residential units on River and then jobs on the north side of Labish Ditch at $36 million. That study does kind of go into a little bit about who has the breakdown of responsibility. Some of those are going to fall back on the city. Some of those are going to push responsibility onto the county to address, and then some the state. So there's a lot of pages of data there, and you can see exactly what they're talking about. But it comes down to from the Brooks interchange and Quinnipiac, Clear Lake Road, and then all the River Road and all the traffic down that. Let me pause there and see if there's any questions about that.
And this was just looking at transportation, not the other factors that you were looking at on that prior slide. The cost of expanding water,
Correct.
sewer,
Yes.
cost to the power companies to expand electrical.
Yeah, it was very specific to transportation and what that type of job creation and housing creation would do to the transportation. I think the study was called Cost of Growth on the Transportation System or something like that was the actual title of it. So it was just specifically to the transportation pieces of that to kind of put a number in 2020 numbers to put a cost to what kind of improvements would need to be done to, and that's not talking about the local roads that would be built by developers. It's talking about the larger systemic roads that serve the greater area, because a function of that was also with assuming that portions of River Road are redeveloping with more things. So.
So, and a lot of people would ask, well, don't developers pay for the development? Does new development pay for itself? Yes, at some level, but we also don't have the system development charges that would cover the type of expenses that it would incur. And so we pulled some data in here that came from the cost of growth study that showed the average system development charges for single-family homes in urban growth boundary expansion areas. They're pretty high, from a low of $43,000 to a high of $46,000. And I'll look at that and compare it to the average expansion. This is from the 2018 data. You can see the average SDC is much higher than the average of all the other lands that are already incorporated in the city.
So question, just to make sure I understand, the average expansion areas are those, as for construction in UGB expansion areas where you are not currently serving, and the SDCs and the average other areas are for new construction within already served land within an urban growth boundary. Is that correct? That's what the difference is?
Yep.
Yes, and that was specific to those examples that they looked at in the state at that time.
Yeah, some of which you've mentioned already. North Bethany, Copper Mountain, South Copper Mountain, South Hillsborough, and River Terrace.
Question, Council President Starr?
So that study was from 2018. I have to think they've got something more recent. I mean,
We
that's
haven't.
a big consulting company, so.
Yeah, they probably do. They've probably done, because we know they've been working on other UGB expansions.
Right.
Like McMinnville, Woodburn. So we could probably get that for our
I
cost.
think it would be good for us to have them, if there is something more current, to have that.
Yeah, and then, of course, we'd have to calculate what that means, what that would look like for Kaiser.
Right.
We could check to see if there's any, so this cost of growth study that we did was, specifically done for us through a education and outreach grant through the TGM program. So I can check with the LCD with our rep and see, has there been any other studies kind of like the one we did in 2018 that are newer? And I can report back and see. It's hard. It was it was an odd study. Like, it was a program that we were like, oh, what is this? Okay, if you guys want to do some work for us, that would be great. A lot of times when folks and communities are looking at UGB expansion, they're more interested in the data that is specific to their community versus education and outreach, because they've maybe already made that policy decision on we are expanding or we have to expand because we have no other choice. But I will definitely check in and see if we can find anything that's more recent that's been done, something similar to that.
Well, yeah, and the company that did this study, I have to think has done something in the last 6 years, almost 7 years. Okay, thank
Good
you.
question, Council President.
And then as a follow-up to do our new methodology, we would then have to go through the process of updating the Kaiser system development charge methodology, because our methodology is very, very old, mostly because we haven't been doing large-scale redevelopment. So there has been a motivation to relook at that, but that would trigger that study as well, and there's a cost. Because we can't just say, you know what, I think it's going to cost this and increase the system development charges. They actually have to be developed through a methodology. You have to prove it before you can tell the developers this is what you have to pay. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, yeah, it has to be defensible.
Okay. That's a good word, defensible. Okay. That's one of Mr. Lindsay's words.
So there's another aspect of the cost of growth, which is the non-fiscal aspect. And as we did the output or outreach for the strategic planning process a year and a half ago, we got this back in a lot of different forms through the individual respondents and through committees about this small town tension with growth. Like, we want growth, but we also want to maintain this small town feel. So that's another consideration, and maybe something also to feather out with some type of public engagement of what that means to people, what that looks like to people. Changes to the character of neighborhoods, impacts on schools, we are a one high school city, and my understanding is we have an agreement with the school district right now that our boundaries are coterminous with the school districts, or the high school's boundaries. So what does that look like? Traffic congestion and associated dangers, and any other environmental costs. So just things to consider. None of those are barriers, but just for consideration. So we want to cover some of the opportunities from the governor's one-time exception that was passed last year. And it gave cities more than 25,000 people one-time opportunity to expand to a maximum of 100 net residential acres. So some of the criteria in there are, we'll go over. The site is one of the following, needs to be one of the following. It's designated urban reserve, which we don't have any of that left. Non-resource land, that means the forest or farmland. And subject to an exception of planning goals for farm and forest land, which are lands typically zoned rural residential, rural industrial, or rural commercial, and are not considered farmland or forest land, so exceptions to that. We talked about, and you've talked about the EFU. That is the land that has to be designated by county as protected farmland or forest land, mostly Marion County has both of those. So this map to the right of the narrative there is, you see the city boundaries in the dark line, and you see our exception lands. And then everything else around it is EFU. That's the legend on the right side of it. So all this is considered EFU or protected farmland. So again, it's just a hurdle. I was trying to remember something that I can't remember who said it. I'll go past it. So criteria 4, talked about criteria 3. Criteria 4 is the city has to demonstrate a need for additional land, either under option A or option B. Option A is there's no UGB expansion as has occurred in the last 20 years, and no underdeveloped or contiguous tracts of residential zone land of 20 net residential acres or more already inside the UGB. Or option B, 75% of the UGB expansion areas approved in the past 20 years are already developed or already have an acknowledged comprehensive plan with land use designations in preparation for annexation. So again, both of those are problematic for us. And then
Can I press pause? I have a question on criteria 4. On the option A, no UGB expansion, and you might have to look this up. When we brought Kaiser Rapids Park into the city, was that a UGB change?
It was. I don't know that for this bill, though, when I look through it and read it, I don't know that that in and of itself would eliminate it because it wasn't for housing. Because there are these narrow exceptions for bringing in lands into a UGB for recreational purposes only. Like we had to put what's called a 4F designation on that Kaiser Rapids Parkland, so it could not be developed into anything but recreational. So I don't think that in and of itself would say you're discredited. I think it's kind of the other pieces that are maybe bigger hurdles for us. The other thing I will say is that it's a hard one. I called up the guy who is the UGB guy at the state of Oregon and chatted with him last week and told him we had this conversation coming. And I was like, hey, so talk to me. So when I read 1537, there's this carve out for Metro that's treated differently because it's sort of like this big shared UGB. But then everything else is just talking about a city. But we're still a shared UGB. So how does this apply to us? And I gotta be honest, the phone just went really quiet for a little while. And then he said, Shayna, I'm not sure that I know how to answer that question. So anyway, I don't know why I share that. Maybe just to say, hey, this is the world I'm living in these days, so be gentle. But yeah, so I'm not sure that the state knows how they would deal with a one-time UGB expansion and or the exchange piece because of the shared element. We have some ideas and some slides. We have that, but the state themselves was kind of like, really good question. Don't have an answer for you.
Well, I've got one more. Hopefully, it's a really good question, then we'll go on to criteria 5. 20 net residential acres or more inside UGB, does that include mixed use because that has a residential component? Because we do have that and more within the River Cherry Overlay District.
I don't know the answer to that.
The Lock Haven Center has even more. So
Yeah, if it's aggregated, it would. I don't know that there's any single property that would meet that, but yeah.
Add that to the list of,
Yeah.
That's a really good question.
that's why I love this term we came up with this morning, the ambiguity of where and how.
Yeah.
It just seems applicable to this whole presentation. So.
Well, that's land use 101 for Oregon is, that's a good question. And I think that's been how it's been from the beginning of Senate Bill 100. We figure it out as we go.
Yeah. So criteria 5 has to, goes to the demonstrated need for severely cost-burdened households or rent-burdened household. And correct me if I'm wrong, Shane, but I think we have not been included in that rent-burdened or cost-burdened. Now, a lot of us might disagree with that, but as far as the actual numbers, we don't fit that mold.
We used to. Yeah, we were severely rent burden for quite some time.
Yeah, we haven't been for the last 3 years. So we used to have to hold that hearing every year. For a few years we did, and then I think it's been the last 3 years, because I was surprised that we came off the list.
Okay,
But yeah, we did come off that list I think it was 3 cycles ago.
okay. So about 2021-ish, we came off that list.
I believe so. Now, we might be right back on it this next year. We've been hovering close.
Okay, so we're
So.
kind of,
Yeah.
and again, another variable in the mix.
And another variable that if you're looking at the whole UGB, because I do believe Salem was severely cost burdened last year. I think they were in the criteria of having to hold the extra hearing. So maybe it's possible we could meet that criteria in the whole of the UGB. I don't know. I don't have that data or that math, but it might be. So
Oh, okay.
A question that keeps coming to my mind throughout the last week of studying this is, if we're in the shared UGB, why do we do all these studies separately then, or considered separately when it comes to cost burdened or rent burdened? But why do we do a separate housing needs analysis? Why do we do a separate economic opportunities analysis if we are shared? I don't have an answer for that, but it's a question that's continually comes to my mind, and maybe we should be asking.
Council President Starr?
So when you've been thinking about that, Mr. Brown, do we think that if we did them together or jointly with Salem, would it come out? I mean, aside from the cost to us individually, have we thought about if we did them jointly, would that come out as a benefit to us or a negative to us in terms of the overall result?
Yeah, that's a good question. If the area as a whole, and my last meeting with Salem about this subject with the staff from Polk and Marion counties was that they were going to run out of their 20-year land supply and need to do a housing needs analysis in the next 6 years. And at that meeting, we haven't formalized it, but they said, well, we would be willing to commit to doing a study together, which I think would be a great idea. But if you do a study together, then you would, it seems to me like you would have to consider both areas as an option to solving the problem. However, if the lands down there are, it's still in that shared UGB, are lesser quality, then we could be forced to have the development down there. So, not sure. But good question. I appreciate the questions all of you are answering, because these are the questions that our citizens have. If they're coming to you, then they're questions shared by somebody else. So that's basically our coverage of the one-time governor's allowance, which I think is problematic at best. So talking about a UGB, an exchange within the UGB. And what I would say to this one is this is a possibility. We would still have to overcome protection of the farmland. But if we can have agreement from 4 governing bodies, I've seen a lot more done taking the political side, the political route of that. 4 governing bodies that agree and some state legislators that support that, something could get done. And I would say that would almost have to be out of this one-time the governor's opportunity and out of the traditional path, basically you're circumventing everything that's in place to stop you from doing that. Yes, yeah.
I'm going to ask a question, then go to Councilor Kohler, but Goal 1, public participation, that would still be in play, correct?
Yeah, I think that was something Shane mentioned this morning as we were talking about that we have to demonstrate participation.
Yeah, and I mean that's. I don't have any real answers on this. I think I told Adam talk about this more than me because it's a little bit confusing to me. I'm not actually sure that the UGB exchange but the way that the bill's written and the language that got enrolled and is now there, I'm not sure if we can even qualify for it at all, regardless, because of what the land types are that are there. But I think with what Mr. Brown is saying is that, if you took kind of a non-traditional path, sometimes things can get shifted. The one thing that's interesting about the one-time expansion and or exchange, in the bill it actually does outline kind of what that Goal 1 requirement looks like, and it's pretty darn minimal. It's like have a public hearing. I mean, it's pretty small, so it's not. I mean, it does kind of outline it in the bill itself. Like, hey, you have to have a meeting, you have to do notice, you have to give this much time for comment. So it does kind of spell that out. So I think you'd probably still have to do those pieces. I would think. It's yeah.
Well, and that kind of segues right into the kind of the last two slides. Here is something, in considering this expansion, what are we trying to accomplish? It could be any number of these things: housing, affordable housing, jobs, commercial activity, economic stability. And maybe that's not a question we want to answer without some feedback from our citizenry, our residents. So the public engagement, the last public engagement document we had was, while talking about this subject, was the Kaiser Compass, which is now 15 years old. So this is kind of where we wanted to end up with this. Do you want to know where our community is on the issue? And if the answer is yes, we would want to try to do some type of education sufficient enough for them to make an informed decision on that and then get that back to us. Addressing some questions like that small town versus growth conflict, and what's our community lacking, and what would a UGB expansion meet? What kind of community need would that meet? So we, as a staff, would recommend, we understand our limitations on the capacity to do this and also to do it in something that's statistically significant, sound research. So we would recommend that we use an external source, and I don't have a lead or an idea of who that would be, but there's lots of firms that operate in that space that could organize a good public engagement campaign and get you some data that you would feel comfortable making some decisions on.
Councilor Kohler, you had a question?
Oh, I have a couple, but in 2018 and 19, we did a whole bunch of public engagement outreach. So that isn't 15 years old.
Yep.
So we have had public engagement a lot sooner than what you just had said.
Yeah, with that cost of growth study and then the
all
update in
kinds of
2020 and
Yeah, it was done by an outside firm, so there was a lot of it there.
yeah.
But follow up on the other thing here, it's UBG exchange would require all four governing bodies. So my question is, would that have to be approved by the planning department of each of those entities, or the councils or the commissions for each of those counties?
Yeah, the governing body would be the city council and the county commissioners. And then,
'Cause I don't have a lot of trust in the planning department of some institution
Ouch.
south of here.
other
You
instances.
don't need to go there.
South of here.
Yeah, we don't, we need to go,
It would, yeah, it would definitely be that SCAPAC process.
Yeah.
If not everybody concurred. So,
Yeah, the resolution, the appeal process is through this
Yeah.
back.
Perfect, thank you.
and I have one other question, I'll go to Council President Starr, and that is, the property owners of any of the property that's being considered, especially to be removed, would that be a takings?
I don't know that I can answer that official takings term question because that's really more the lawyer's space. There is some language in the bill.
Not that lawyer, that lawyer.
Yeah. There is some language in the bill that actually speaks to property owners that are being removed, and there are some basically abilities that the bill gives the city to remove them without their concurrence. However, then there's this piece in there that talks about if that property owner that's going to be removed is willing to sign something with the city that says they're going to guarantee the development of their property within the 20-year time frame, then they would have the right to appeal it. Otherwise, they don't have appeal rights on the UGB adjustment. And that's in the 1537 language itself. Again, I got deep into that sucker and was reading it, and then, they go, oh, if it's sub 50-1, and then it bounces you to here, and then to here, and then to here. And I definitely felt, I'm glad that I'm not a lawyer. So, but yeah, I think I've heard that question, and in the circles that I run in, that exact question. I think it's a really good question. And I don't know if Mr. Lindsay has some to add on that, but that would, like I said, there was some language built into the legislative document that said, hey, you can do this and you can do this subject to this, that kind of spelled it out.
I will also I'll address that as well, having researched it a little bit more, because I'm not going to be able to give a much better answer than that right now and at the moment. But also, just I say this a decent amount. You can be sued for anything at any time, anywhere, but that it doesn't mean it has merit. And so I think sometimes those carve-outs take away some of that merit to the case, but it doesn't mean somebody wouldn't try. The other piece of this is there are lawsuits that come about when we do these things, oftentimes from folks who just don't like expansion to begin with. So there's both sides. The Thousand Friends folks and groups like that do show up. So whenever you're doing this, it's liability intensive to a certain degree, but a carve out like that in the law is always nice because it does mean that sensible folks probably won't come after you, maybe just the irrational ones.
I'm not going to speculate on the state of mind of people who are engaging in litigation, but what I will say is that, again, looking back at what happened in North Plains, there were parties on both sides that had some significant motivation for what they did, and it did not go well for the city of North Plains at the end.
You get pinched on all
Got
sides.
pinched bad.
sometimes. Yeah.
So even with every T crossed and every I dotted. So just want to be aware of that. Council President Starr.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Brown, I think you were asking, there we go, right there. What direction, and I know we can't make a decision here. I would be curious to see, I know we're coming up to the end of October, and before we know it, we'll be in budget planning season. I know that you love to hear that, Mr. Wood. We're almost there again. But I would be interested in seeing some proposals or kind of an estimated cost to doing a public engagement campaign and process on this issue. Before that, because obviously then things wouldn't be approved until after July, be able to spend it after July. I'm curious why we couldn't do a couple of town halls in the first part of the year, 2 or 3 town halls on this issue, just inviting the community to come and have a conversation about it. It doesn't have to be part of a formal public engagement. I think we should have conversations, and then maybe that will give us direction about moving forward with a public engagement campaign. But let's have conversations about it in the form of town halls. I think that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, thank you for that. That is something I think within our wheelhouse that we could do.
I mean, just this presentation, maybe, different pieces of it, not the full presentation, because it's we've been here a while, but just maybe some highlights, and then open it up for conversation and questions from the community. But I'd like to see 3 or 4 town halls, different areas of the community, different times, that type of thing.
Yeah, what do the rest of the council think about that? I kind of like it.
Well, one thought I have is when you engage with a consultant who does public engagement, putting these events on or town halls and so forth is often part of the package. It's not necessarily just statistical surveying and so forth, but when you have, when we did the Kaiser Compass, that included many public engagement processes where they had tools and methodologies for getting information from people as well as to people to make sure that the feedback we got back was really going to inform the results, was really going to inform decision-making. So I think that having some level of assistance in putting those together can help make those productive for getting data that we can use for decision-making going forward. So I would still like to see what that would look like to have additional assistance, because our city staff, as skilled as you are, it would be good to have some additional assistance in that. That's my opinion. Councilor Kohler? Do you have a thought one way or the other on the public engagement?
All I know is that we got to start somewhere.
Okay.
So can we as a council do the town halls? I mean, why? I don't think we need to pay a consultant to have a conversation with our community. So can we just plan that, or in partnership, or do we need a consultant to help us plan a town hall? I don't think we do. I think we're capable of having a conversation.
I think that's something within our wheelhouse. I mean, I've done a lot of town halls over the last 25 years. A lot of.
So at least that would be, I'm going to go Councilor Reed.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I could, go one way or the other, whether it's town halls first or, engaging the outside people. I have seen where, again, it could go both ways. It depends on what we want out of this. If we want just random information, that could be valuable, but if we want more targeted questions, I think in that case it might be better to have the external group. So it kind of depends on what kind of information we're looking for. If we're just looking for general feedback, it's really easy to pack a house with a few well-placed social media posts or whatever, and those packed houses may or may not get to the actual opinions of everyone, I guess, which, is problematic in any kind of statistical analysis. You never know, how reliable they are. So that's, I realize I'm kind of rambling, but I could go either way. Do we have any kind of funds to do engage just like in a pre-consulting sort of capacity?
Well, my recollection is we had some money set aside from ARPA money for the UGB exploration. If not, I mean, I think there's money in the general fund that we could use. But, you know, to get people out, usually all it takes is food.
Okay, well, that's a good point. And they will come.
Food and, a decent amount of message, a good message. Yeah.
I mean, if all we want is to get our finger on sort of the pulse of the general sort of feeling, yes or no, then that could be valuable. But if we want any kind of, I mean, this took 2 hours, but even so, 2 hours is a whole lot to put us down is hardly anything, rather, to put us down the path of a very expensive, very lengthy sort of process. So, again, if all we want is to get our finger on the pulse of the general yes or no, are we interested in proceeding, then, perhaps a town hall would suffice. But if we want more targeted data than that, or targeted feedback even, we might do better to hire somebody externally.
What I'd like to do at this point is leave it with Mr. Brown. I did ask him. Yeah, I started with you. Okay, all right, I'll circle back to you. Yeah?
Well, I feel that doing an informal one would be a benefit. I mean, I could bring in a lot of people that would definitely be a no. But I would like to see the people that are for it, for an expansion. So I think we can get in I think we'd get enough information to make it worth doing. A couple informal, or at least one or two. We've done quite a few of these. 2018, we spent a lot of time here with consultants. I don't know why we couldn't put together something like we have done, here, and the ones we've done with the city of Salem recently for CFAC stuff. So if we can do something rather informal, and I think we can get enough information to let us feel confident that we're going in one direction or the other, especially if we're going to spend a ton of money on consultants down the road. If it's overwhelming, we're not going to get support of the citizens. Why do we want to spend a bunch of money? If we get overwhelming support of the citizens to go for it, then, well, maybe we need to kick it in gear and put a little more effort into it. So I think getting a pulse would be beneficial.
If we can finally get it off the short and long-term goals list, or at least put something specific on there in the next biennium. All right, do you have enough to go on for putting together some ideas to bring back to us for further consideration?
Yep.
Anything?
And just thank you for giving us the opportunity. I've learned a lot in just preparing for this, and hopefully it was educational, informative, and hopefully we'll have this recording on our website so that people can, if they so choose,
Right.
can listen.
I appreciate filming this so we can get it onto the website, so we can, or at least getting the information out there so people can listen, go through the same materials. And this has been very, very informative. And I really appreciate the work that went into that. But it's a conversation our community has really been needing to have, especially in our different economy after the pandemic era. So anything further, Councilor Duran?